At age 38, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a rising political star. The Democratic nominee for Vice President of the United States. At age 39, he was crippled from the waist down, a victim of the polio that would leave his legs paralyzed for the rest of his life.
He had always had this confident, buoyant, optimistic temperament, and yet when the polio came, it was tested severely. He would spend hours, as he said, just trying to move his one toe a little bit. It made him calm and patient in a way that he had not been before. At one point he fell when he was going to a meeting, and he sprawled out on the floor, and then he just got himself up and he said, "I'm okay, guys." He realized that there were going to be embarrassing moments, and they were, but if he got through those, that somehow he could get through the tougher things that were going to happen to him.
In time, he would overcome the toughest possible challenges. He would remake the world and conquer his own limitations. In the America of the 1920s, serious physical handicaps were seen as weak and shameful. It was unheard of for anyone to lead from a wheelchair. But 7 years after contracting polio, Franklin Roosevelt defied the odds and was elected governor of New York.
Once he got to be governor, I think there was a humility that hadn't been there before, and there was a sense of identifying with other people to whom fate had also dealt an unkind hand, because he'd had this incredibly privileged life up until that point. There's no question that it deepened him. It made him a much more interesting person than he would have been before.
FDR's polio made him attuned to the suffering of others. It also helped the average American feel connected to him.
He was a patrician. He was from an old family, had enormous wealth. He had his chin and his lockjaw. And if you're an American living somewhere in the middle of the country, how are you going to relate to this man? The idea that the president himself is struggling with personal trials, this can hearten the American people, can make them say, he's on my side.
As Roosevelt's fortunes rose, the country plunged into a deep and desperate depression. The Great Depression cost millions their life savings. 16 million jobs vanished. In their place, breadlines and starvation. When one economist was asked if there was any historical precedent, he replied, yes. It lasted 400 years and was called the Dark Ages.
The president began this campaign with the same attitude with which he has approached so many of the serious problems of the past 3 years. He sought to create the impression that there was no campaign on at all, just as he had sought to create the impression that all was well with the United States and that there was no depression.
In 1932, a despairing country turned to the jubilant man whose campaign theme song was "Happy Days Are Here Again."
FDR's warm smile and emotional oratory made themselves felt, and he had a ready-made issue. The United States was in the throes of the worst depression in its history. This was Roosevelt's battle cry, and he made the most of it.
He flew through a storm to become the first man ever to accept a presidential nomination in person.
You have nominated me, and I know it, and I am here to thank you for the honor.
No president since Lincoln had faced such a dire crisis.
This nation is asking for action, and action now.
FDR's first order of business seemed impossible: solving the banking crisis. He had to restore public confidence and persuade Americans to put their money back into the banking system. A week after taking office, he gave his first fireside chat.
After all, there is an element in the readjustment of our financial system more important than currency, more important than gold, and that is the confidence of the people themselves. Let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work. It is your problem, my friends, your problem no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail.
He would give these radio chats, these fireside chats, to all Americans. And in doing so, he was not just their president, he was not just their leader, but most Americans felt that somehow they could persist, that they could go on because they had a friend, and that friend was FDR.
He didn't end the Depression, but what he did do was to alleviate the despair that people were feeling. Because people felt all these bad things are happening and nobody's in charge. Nobody cares about me. What Roosevelt demonstrated is the government does care about you, and we will do something for you. We will fix this.
FDR restored public confidence in the government. But it would take a world war to jumpstart the American economy and transform his place in history.
If World War II hadn't come along, he would have had to retire after 2 terms. And the Depression would have continued. The New Deal would have been vulnerable to attack by Republicans. And so everything that Roosevelt is remembered for would be either non-existent or negative. And he, of course, wouldn't become the great war hero of World War II. So Roosevelt's career and his reputation was rescued by World War II.
Adolf Hitler came to power just weeks before Roosevelt took office as president. Early on, FDR saw Nazi Germany on a collision course with America and the forces of freedom. Even as Hitler's armies overran Europe, most Americans wanted no part of another terrible war.
And they also were still remembering the horrors of World War I, that terrible trench warfare in which an entire generation of young men advanced out only to be mowed down by machine guns and artillery fire. And all for nothing, another war. So why should the United States get involved in another world war?
The imminent danger of war lies in the action taken by President Roosevelt and his supporters.
And polls showed that even in 1941, the American people, by a very large majority, as much as 85%, said, even at the risk of Great Britain falling, the United States should not go to war.
FDR had seen World War I labeled Mr. Wilson's War and was determined not to make the same mistake. In private, he maneuvered to give all possible assistance to Winston Churchill and Great Britain. In public, he insisted on neutrality.
We will not participate in foreign wars, and we will not send our army, naval or air forces to fight in foreign lands outside of the Americas, except in case of attack.
He promised peace, even as he knew the United States could not avoid war.
The Battle of the Pacific spread today over a 5,000-mile front, following yesterday's shattering and unprovoked attacks by the Japanese on Hawaii, the Philippines, Guam, Wake, and Midway.
He let public opinion build to the point where, when the United States was attacked at Pearl Harbor by Japan, a clear cause for war, that he didn't even immediately say, okay, this means war. He said, well, we've got to think this over carefully.
Great battleships, 5 years in the building, were horrible wreckage in that many minutes.
Senators and members of the House of Representatives who previously had been skeptical of American involvement in the wars in Europe and Asia They said, if he doesn't ask us for a declaration war, we're going to declare war over his opposition. And that's exactly what Roosevelt wanted to happen, because he needed this buy-in of the American people. It had to be America's war.
When war came, he was ready. Patience, fortitude, determination. All the powers he had summoned to surmount polio would serve him well in the dark days ahead.
During Pearl Harbor, when everybody was rushing around as the news was coming, people said that they'd never had more respect for him. He just sat there calmly absorbing the news, saving his anger and all the feelings he was feeling inside for the speech the next day. He had that ability, I think, when things were going around him, and maybe it was the patience and the calmness he'd had to learn from all those years when he was trying unsuccessfully to walk again, to just let the swirl go around him and just remain the rock in the middle of it all.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.